Our first question to you then will be, what would you identify as the three most important events through which ethnic groups, communities and or activists have changed Australia's public culture in the past 20 years?
Well, that presumes that they have changed Australia's public culture, which has changed, but I mean, I would think that there's an interplay between government and ethnic groups in that relationship, and that a lot of the driving forces come more from government than from ethnic groups. However, if we accept your question, well, the founding of FECA, firstly the founding of the Ethnic Communities Councils in Victoria and New South Wales in 1974, and then 5 years later the founding of FECA in 1979, because FECA's fairly unique in the world. There are sort of equivalents in Canada and the United States, but they don't have anything like the influence. And then after that, there's a whole, once FECA's formed, it gets built into the government consultative structure. So it'd be hard to pick an actual particular event, but I suppose the participation again of FECA around the debates in, say, 1986, 87, 88, leading up to the bicentennial, the Blaney debate and the whole notion, the argument around the bicentennial. They did play a significant role there. Most of the other things that have happened since then, like with the National Agenda for Multicultural Australia and that, have come out of government, but with FECA and ECCs built into the consultative structure, so you can't actually say who's initiating what, but it's a sort of interplay. Some of the ideas came up through FECA and government implements, and some of the ideas come from government and FECA endorses them. I can't think of any particular event in the last 5 years that you could say this was tremendously important. Now, all the time there I'm talking about ECCs and FECA. Of course, there are individual ethnic communities which are very often more powerful and better organised and have more money and more resources than FECA or the ECCs.
Could you point to some examples?
Well, in the Greek community is obviously an example, and the Jewish community, they would be the two best organised and most politically effective ethnic communities, in my opinion. Jewish community keeping Middle Eastern affairs and Greek community keeping Balkan affairs within the public area of discussion. I suppose the other two significant developments there is the partial consolidation of the Arabic community around the Gulf War. Prior to that, they'd been very fragmented and ineffective, and that brought them together. And then the recent organisation of the Chinese community, which was particularly important because of Australia's reorientation towards Asia. I suppose the Chinese and Vietnamese communities, both of which are fairly well organised and have daily newspapers and so on, they will assume more importance because all the other ethnic activity has been predominantly European. But it's only really in the last 3 or 4 years that you've got those two major Asian communities organising and taking a role in politics. But I mean, I couldn't fix... If you want fixed dates, you'd say the Gulf War, the two, I suppose, Greek-Macedonian disputes of 88 and 93, they sort of focused these communities. And I think the Blaney, not only the Blaney debate, but the Howard debate, which followed, that was important in consolidating the Chinese and Vietnamese communities too.
So you're actually talking about communities consolidating on the basis of situations or occurrences outside of Australia,
yeah,
rather than...
well, not entirely outside Australia, because the Blaney and Howard issue was inside Australia. Yeah, I think, as I said in the chapter that I wrote in the Politics of Immigration book, FECA and the ECCs have concentrated very much on Australian domestic issues like migrant settlement, welfare services, language policy and so on. They've deliberately done that because if they start getting involved in overseas issues, they get involved in disputes between their components, and that would be not a very good idea. So they have concentrated very much on Australian domestic issues, most of which are not, terribly exciting. I mean, they're sort of service delivery and sort of fairly mundane, incremental kind of things which don't hit the headlines. I think one of the problems with multiculturalism, and I said this in the conference in Darwin a couple of 2 or 3 weeks ago, is that in Australia it's still based on immigrants, whereas in the United States and Canada it's based on old established communities. Some of them, like say the French Canadians, go back 350 years. Whereas here multiculturalism is very much seen as concern of immigrants, and therefore what happens back home is still important to them. And that's a strength in the way that it consolidates people around, but it's also a weakness in that it alienates them from long-term Australians who see these as foreign issues, which have nothing to do with them.
In response to the first question, where you said that that's assuming that the communities actually took a lead in the affairs rather than government. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, there hasn't been a proper an academically respectable analysis of how multiculturalism developed as yet. There's no single text. And there's only a very limited number of articles, some of which I've written, some of which George Zabritsky and 1 or 2 others have written. There is an argument which some of the opponents of multiculturalism, right-wing opponents, have brought up, that it was really just invented by a government to get the ethnic vote, and the ethnic communities didn't want it, and it was just sort of given to them. That's, I think, not historically true. I think if you look at the origins of the ethnic movements in Sydney and Melbourne, they did arise out of a certain amount of frustration with the political system and the situation of migrants and so on. And then government took it up. But I think it's true to say that the formulation of multicultural policy, certainly since the founding of FECA in '79, has been an interplay between government, both Commonwealth and state, and FECA and the ECCs, particularly FECA. And that certainly since the Office of Multicultural Affairs was set up in 1987, a lot of that formulation has come from government, from the Commonwealth government, and from the Ethnic Affairs Commissions, particularly New South Wales. And I think, as long as those government and ethnic communities are working jointly together, that's fine. But I think, to some extent, FECA and the ECCs have faded a bit, in my opinion, since the EACs and the OMA, because they have more resources, far more resources, and government has far more resources than voluntary organisations, and FECA and the ECCs are totally dependent on government funds. So they can't really have an equal relationship, it has to be rather unequal. The main initiatives that came out of the ethnic communities were firstly ethnic-specific services leading up to Galbally in 1978. Then defending Galbally since then, because of the constant attempts of other levels of government to sort of cut it back and redirect it. Defending that. Defending the family reunion elements in immigration. Pushing the national language policy, I think that was quite important. Opposing cuts in services, which governments are doing as often as they can, all over the place. So a lot of this is is defensive. It's, in the last few years, it's been defending existing things against cuts rather than advancing new things. Defending special broadcasting service against attempts to amalgamate. So I would see their role as increasingly defensive rather than innovatory. And of course, since the dissolution of the Advisory Council of Multicultural Affairs, of which I was a member, there is no national advisory body in the multicultural area. And in fact, 91, 92, there was no national advisory body in any immigration or multicultural area for the first time since about 1947. Now they have now got the Settlement Advisory Council. I think the government's intending to revive the Multicultural Advisory Council, but nobody quite knows when or who's going to be on it. But certainly, particularly under Jerry Hand, all these national advisory bodies were dissolved. And that weakened the input, from FEC and the ECC.
You said disillusionment about the advisory council that you were on.
No, dissolution.
Dissolution.
It was dissolved.
Right, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Why did Jerry do that?
He didn't like advisory councils, as far as I can gather. ACMA came to the end of its term, because they're usually appointed for about 3 years. It came to the end of its term and nothing happened. It just wasn't reappointed. It wasn't abolished. It was nothing. It just disappeared. National Population Council was abolished. Was again terminated. Came to the end of its term. Was not reappointed. Which is the main body in immigration. So the main body in multiculturalism and the main body in immigration just disappeared. Now this was because they have had these two agencies under various names since the 1970s. And then for a period of 2 or 3 years you didn't have them at all. And that, I think that was probably a personal choice of the minister. Another of the points about multiculturalism was that, of course, until 1987 it came under immigration. So again, it was always seen as for immigrants. But even since 1987, the minister has been the same person. Because although Office of Multicultural Affairs is in Prime Ministers, the minister responsible for it is the Minister for Immigration. So, which is a bit of a problem. I think also, and this is a bit hard to pin down, that Bob Hawke took much more interest in this area than Paul Keating had. And the message comes down, that it's not a priority area anymore. I think since we changed Prime Minister, it's the priority of multiculturalism has probably declined, although it would be hard to say how you could prove that one way or the other. But that's a general impression you get around the place, at least I get around the place.
Do you think it's been subsumed somewhat into, rather than being a multicultural, into the idea of redefining ourselves as a republic?
Yeah, it's moved in a couple of directions. One is all the debate leading up to 2001, which is similar to the debate leading up to 1988, which is what is Australia, what is an Australian, what are we doing, are we part of Asia, should we sever the last links with Britain, all this stuff. Multiculturalism tends to get, it's a bit less exciting than that. It tends to sort of fall down to the bottom of the pile. The other thing is that I think OMA redefined multiculturalism as being essentially concerned with access and equity. That is, it became a part of the public service reform structure, which tended to start moving it away from its earlier concerns with cultural maintenance, language policy, even community relations. That still has that function. So it really became part of the overall restructuring and reforming of the public service, which is necessary and desirable, that people should have equitable delivery of services, but it's only a part. I think also there's been I think people don't actually know what they want to do next anyway. I mean, I don't think the ethnic communities movement for a few years, I mean, prior to Vic becoming the president, I think it was relatively leaderless, with all due respect, you know, to Karl Harbauer. It really faded as a significant force for various reasons. And I think they got into a circle of, you know, redefining the wheel every year at their Congress and not actually trying to look into the future. So I think the whole thing went in the whole area's been redefined. There's also being redefined away towards diversity, which includes Aborigines and gays and women and disabled. I mean, and suddenly, instead of being focused on ethnic minorities, it's suddenly focused on everybody who's a bit different, which is in fact a substantial majority of the population. So it sort of dissolves into the concept of diversity. And I think the attack on consistent niggling away at multiculturalism from right-wing journalists and academics and radio and television I mean, that's been going on for years, and that has penetrated into the thinking of public servants, some of it coming from North America as well. There's quite an attack on multiculturalism coming out of United States conservative circles and coming in.
From the Canadian experience, you mean? Or?
No, more United States. There's a fairly consistent conservative attack on. Well, the Canadians are re-questioning. But most of the right-wing critics here pick up their stuff direct from the United States. Canada would have more influence on the government level. But because of the fairly rapid changes in America and the rise of the Hispanic population and so on, and Asian migration to California, there's been a bit of a backlash in America. And that comes straight here through the conservative networks. So I think that's been a factor in. There have been a number of factors which have made it look, to me at least, as though it's been sagging a bit over the last few years.
So who still supports it?
Well, about half the population, not judging by such. It's not an opinion poll question normally. But if you reinterpret other opinion polls, you'd say about half the population. I think the great majority of organised ethnic communities and media and leaders support it. I think it has quite a lot of support amongst the general population, but it's like the attitudes to immigration. It's related to education, and the better educated people are more in favour of this than the less well-educated people, which is the same in other countries. I mean, there is a real correlation between racist attitudes and education, and attitudes to immigration and education in most Western countries. I think what you'd broadly call a sort of liberal intelligentsia are in favour of it. Most ethnic leaders, most of the ethnic media, some of the mainstream media and newspapers like The Age or Canberra Times. Sydney Morning Herald is a bit 50-50, And the attack on it comes from what you'd expect from the sort of Murdoch Dregs papers. And even then, I think the Australian's changed its attitude quite a bit in recent years. The Australian used to be one of the major agencies for attacking multiculturalism. So I would think, a good half of the population and probably more than half of the vocal and influential population. The political parties all support it. The Liberals went through that turmoil with Howard particularly, and with Hewson, and they just learnt, they started looking at their voters and listening to the Chinese particularly, and they've turned around. I mean, the Liberal Party's now back where it was with Fraser, I think. So it went through that phase of responding to a conservative attack under Howard and Hewson, but it learnt its lesson there. I mean, the National Party doesn't care about anything much, but they go along with the Liberals on it. The RSL is against it, but they're That's an elderly men's organisation of declining significance. I think the only, there are quite vocal and consistent opponents of multiculturalism, but I think they're probably a minority. Because it doesn't do any harm, you see. I mean, it is actually a harmless ideology, really. And the only people who are worried about it are people who are very old-fashioned or very anxious or very racist or, subterranean racists. People who just, either insecure or old-fashioned or want things to go back to like they were when they were young, like Geoffrey Blaney. It's my interpretation of him. Or else a raving sort of ratbags like Bruce Ruxton, people like that. Or some of the right-wing, consistently right-wing journalists, although even some of those like Jared Henderson, is a very strong supporter of multiculturalism. So it's also tied in with immigration, because there's a growing trend against immigration. The numbers have come right down. The Greens and the ecologists and so on are all suddenly decided that there's too many people in Australia. And this again reflects what's happening in Europe and North America, because there's so many people moving now, refugees and people coming out of Africa and Asia and Latin America, that there's a worldwide trend against immigration in all Western countries, and that comes down here. So I think because they are, multicultural immigration have always been very closely involved. But as enthusiasm for immigration has dropped right off in government circles as well as, and that tends to drag multiculturalism down with it a bit. But I mean, as as I said, multiculturalism is quite harmless. It's in fact, it's beneficial. We don't have all, people are always waiting for the other boot to drop. They're always waiting for the race riots and this. They never actually happen. This could go on for years and years and years. And I think there are, a lot of good reasons to suppose that they won't happen. So there's always that, well, it must happen here. It's happened in Fiji, it's happened in Yugoslavia, so it has to happen here. But it never has. So people have got sort of used to it. And of course about a quarter of the population are of some degree of non-British ethnic background anyway, so I mean they're likely to be less receptive to the mainstream view than the mainstream, if it is the mainstream.
You were able to talk about more or less 3 events through which ethnic groups have been had an impact. Can you think of perhaps what we might call 3 milestones in the development of a multicultural Australia that haven't necessarily been initiated or spurred on by organised ethnic communities?
Well, I mean the first milestone was in 1947 when the government launched its DP immigration policy and deliberately brought in non-British migrants. So it was the first time that the Commonwealth had ever deliberately encouraged and paid for non-British migrants to come to Australia. So that was the first milestone. The second milestone would be the ending of the White Australia policy, which some people say was in 1966 and some people say was in 1973, but was certainly in that period. I think Galbally report was a milestone, 1978. It's still the basis, it's still one of the foundation stones that multicultural activists are always defending, if that's what you do with foundation stone. I suppose the launching of, the multicultural agenda was in terms of government policy. I don't know whether it hit the general public, but it is influential in determination of government Commonwealth policy and state policy. So that was in 1989. I mean, there are actual dates and events you could put a time on. I think another significant development that you couldn't put an actual date on was what I referred to earlier, which is the attempts of Howard and Hewson to change the track of the Conservative parties and the failure of that. So that's really between 1988 and the final overthrow of Hewson, you know. That's the most recent one. Because it really meant that most of the criticism of multiculturalism has come from the Conservative side of politics in the last 10 years at least. And it meant that they couldn't, you know, that the Conservative parties were inhibited from following that up. Because they're depending on, Liberal Party anyway, depending on ethnic votes to some extent.
In the last 3 points that you made there, the Galbally, the agenda, and the defeat, I guess, of the debate by Howard and Hewson, who actually influenced that process? Why did you actually identify those three?
Well, the first one, 1947, obviously wasn't influenced by ethnic groups because there weren't any. It was purely a government decision based on the perceived needs of Australia at the time, resulting from the Second World War. The ending of White Australia policy was not initiated by ethnic groups because there were no Asians here, or at least there were so few that they were not significant. That was, I think, two factors there. One was agitation in universities, particularly Melbourne, but second, more important, was the foreign policy considerations with regard to Asia, that it was a constant embarrassment to our dealings with the new Asian country. So ethnic groups had no significant role in that one. But by the time you get up to Galbally in 1978, two ethnic communities I think did have a significant influence. That's the Jewish community and Greek community. The model that Galbally took, as I understand it, was the Australian Greek Welfare Society. It was very much something that came out of Melbourne. Because again, something that's happened is the focus of multiculturalism has shifted from Melbourne to Sydney, I think, in the last 10 or 12 years. But certainly in 1978 it was still very much in Melbourne. Sydney was well behind in that regard. And it came out of a realisation by Malcolm Fraser that Whitlam had captured the ethnic vote, so to speak, in inverted commas, that the ethnic vote was getting bigger and bigger, that the Labor Party had made specific attempts to get Southern European support, which it in fact did, and under the advice of Petro Georgiou particularly, who was Fraser's advisor and who was also influential in writing the Galbally report and then became the director of the Australian Institute of Multicultural Affairs. The Liberal Party leadership adopted that welfare model, which I think came almost entirely from Australian Greek welfare and Australian Jewish welfare. That was the model of services being delivered by ethnic communities, particularly those two. Now, once you start delivering services, you start giving money. The money can be used for other purposes as well. So I think that Galbally really represents the first official recognition that ethnic communities had social and political functions. Prior to that, they'd all been seen as song and dance groups or running restaurants, you know. But from Galbally onwards, they were actually started being built into the government structure, because Galbally wasn't just concerned with welfare, we also advocated what became a special broadcasting service as well. So if you read it carefully, it's not just welfare, it's several other multicultural functions. So once you start having a radio station or a television station, once you start paying what was not insignificant subsidies to ethnic organisations, once you start acknowledging the problems of access and equity, that wasn't called that then, but that, once you start doing all that, government is then actually approving of ethnic diversity, which it hadn't done really before. So I think that there was an ethnic input into Galbally, but particularly from the Jew. I think Coasit was, I'm not sure whether Coasit was founded by then, but I think there was also an Italian input from those three communities in Melbourne, particularly from Coasit, from Greek welfare and Jewish welfare. And they were the model for service delivery under Galbally. By the time you get to the national agenda, of course, FECA's in full blast. Advisory Council is functioning. The Ethnic Affairs Commissions have been set up in each state. They're probably at their most influential because most of them have been cut back in recent years, except in Sydney. Most of the others have. So at the state level, at the national level, the ethnic media is firmly established, has an influence. It's been able to build up enough resources to have weekly and daily papers with quite large circulations. And of course the Labor Party, which is in by then, is very conscious of the ethnic character of its electorates, because the Labor Party controls a great majority of electorates with a high ethnic population. So by the time you get to the agenda, that there's a recognition of the electoral base, there's a recognition of the organisations and media are significant. There's a recognition that it's a permanent state of affairs and that assimilation is not going to sweep away the second and third generations, are not necessarily going to disappear, which had previously been a very widespread view in government circles. So I would think, say, between 78 Galbally and 89, the agenda is a sort of golden age, if you like, of multiculturalism. And I think it's sagged a bit since for a number of reasons. One, of course, is that focus has shifted away towards unemployment and economic issues. We've also had a much greater emphasis on Aboriginal issues since then, and that's tended again to far more emphasis on Aboriginal issues and far more money in Aboriginal affairs than there has ever been before in Australian history. And that has tended again to move the spotlight away from the ethnic communities, who are much bigger but are much less troublesome, much less embarrassing than the Aboriginal population.
This perhaps might be a good time to actually ask you about the so-called ethnic vote. Everyone that we've spoken to during this project has a feeling for it one way or another that yes, there definitely is, and just as equally no, there isn't. You're actually cited as being the first person to recognise the phenomenon of the ethnic vote. Could you like to talk a bit about why you actually think there is one?
Well, I mean, part of the argument is over the definition of the term. I suppose if I am the first person to recognise it, that's a comment on the slowness of my colleagues rather than fastness for myself. Because if you look at Canada and the United States, the organisation of ethnic voting blocs has been going on there since, well, for the whole of this century. In fact, in the United States back to the 1870s and 80s, for 100 years. So you only have to look over to North America, which is what I did. I said, well, it's happened there, it's going to happen here. And it's really happened here rather slowly, and in the recent burst of ethnic branch stacking, I would have thought that would have happened 10 or 15 years ago. I think it's taken an awful long time to come. Because it's very common, it's quite normal in the United States, and to a lesser extent in Canada, for politicians to try to organise blocks, ethnic blocks, in their support by various appeals. And you would expect that to happen here, and it's been very inhibited here, I think, because of the Anglo-Australian element of the population is considerably bigger than the Anglo element in Canada or the United States. It's more dominant and more central. And because the ethnic communities are still immigrants, that they've still got one foot in another country, so to speak. And in fact, a lot of them do go back. They have 2 feet in another country and they disappear from the scene. But what I do not think that there are ethnic blocks of voters in the sense that most NESBs, for example, vote one way or the other, because it's such a varied constituency. And there's no reason why Chinese and Italians should vote the same way. Or there could be reasons, but there's no obvious reason. Certainly no reason, why nations which have been at war with each other for several hundred years should support the same candidate. Why Greeks and Turks should support, say, an Arabic candidate. There's no reason why they should. The problem with analysing the ethnic vote is it hasn't been done properly, very rarely done properly, that all analysis of voting is based on sample surveys. Most sample surveys are 2,000 or even less, and you can't get enough hold on ethnic groups to say anything very sensible. However, such work as has been done, and the OMA survey of 1988 was the largest, most expensive and most respectable one, suggests that some ethnic groups are much more likely to vote Labor and some more likely not to vote Labor. So that what I've consistently said all the time, and I think this has been borne out, is that Southern Europeans have been predominantly Labor since the Whitlam period. This varies between them. The Greeks are more Labor than the Italians, for example, and the Greeks and the Maltese, I think. And people have been a bit reluctant to get in amongst the Yugoslavs and find out what the hell they are. But it's probably, if you take the the Mediterranean definition of everyone, Spanish, Portuguese, Italians, Maltese, Yugoslavs, Greeks, and probably Lebanese as well. If you put them together, you've got a really big, this is really the biggest ethnic bloc still. And that is in varying degrees predominantly Labor. Though not necessarily unsusceptible to Liberal appeals. I mean, the Liberals could appeal particularly in the Italian community, I think, and have indeed tried to do so. Nevertheless, this is the largest ethnic bloc, is the Mediterranean bloc, and that seems to be consistently Labor for about 20 years. For various reasons, I mean, one of which is it's of more working class and poorer origins than the others. You can't say much about Northern Europeans, you can't say much about the British. The British seem to, which is the largest single nationality, they tend to split very similarly to Australians, as far as one can tell. Ian McAllister and I did a survey in two British areas of Perth and Adelaide, and we found there wasn't much difference. They were a little bit more pro-Labor than Australians. Most of the surveys tend to find that the Australian-born are the most conservative element in the population, which upsets people who think that Australians are really radical, which is very old-fashioned. And that's partly because there's a bigger rural element amongst Australian-born, and that biases it much more. So Northern Europeans, Germans, Dutch, British, no one's been able to say much about them except they just seem to divide on social background pretty much the same way as Australians. So they're sort of assimilated. The big question, of course, and the growing question, is Asians, who of course weren't even here when I started talking about the ethnic vote, so I couldn't say much about it. There again, they're very varied. But in the OMA survey, which had a recent arrivals column, a very large proportion of whom would have been Asians, they found very strong Labor support there. And that, is the key to the Liberal Party position, because many of particularly the Chinese population here, are very middle class. They live in Liberal electorates, they're in business and the professions, and they're natural Liberal voters. But they were antagonised by the attitudes of Howard, particularly towards Asian immigration. And indeed they told him so. And he had several thousand of them in his own electorate, so he had to pay some attention. So you've got the Chinese would be, Chinese in the general sense, not from China, but from all over. Chinese would be the largest, richest, most widely spread of all the Asian populations. And they should be, really probably more liberal than anything else. But because of this other factor, the feeling that anti-Asian feeling is stronger in the conservative side of politics than the Labor side, they have not behaved as you would expect them to behave. And equally the Vietnamese, who are much more proletarian, they have come out fairly strongly for Labor. Not all their leaders. I mean, some of the leaders are quite right-wing in some of the newspapers, but Vietnamese have, such Vietnamese have been elected, for example, to local councils have been Labor-oriented. And Vietnamese voters have, according to politicians who represent them, are very, mainly Labor. And that is odd because they're refugees from communism. Now, the previous refugees from communism from Eastern Europe are generally held to be liberal, have played an active part in the Liberal Party, but of course are getting very old. Their children are probably liberals too. But that's a sort of dying element, or was a dying element, because nobody was coming out of Eastern Europe. So it looks, in the model that I used in the article I wrote in 1983 or 4, was the North American model, where the outsiders tend to support the more left wing of the two parties. So you get Jews supporting the Democrats in America, supporting the Labor Party here. Then this would equally apply to Chinese, Vietnamese, that because the Conservative Party is the established party society, they tend more to the unestablished party. So that has happened here. That model has worked here to a very large extent. Now, what happens in North America is that some of the outside communities start getting richer and more prosperous and coming inside, and then they move over to the Republicans. Now, you would expect that very much to happen with the Chinese population here. You'd expect them to move over to the Liberals. The other factor here, though, and this just relates to branch stacking, is that ethnics have not entered the political system very significantly. So that this is very contrast to North America. So we have a tiny representation of ethnic, NESB ones in federal parliament, and it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. It's not rising as you expect. It's just staying the same. So that they're still outsiders. They're still outsiders in the political system. They may be, doing well, and getting money and doing well in business, for example, doing well in the professions, particularly Asian, Chinese and Indians doing very well in the professions, East Europeans and Jews and Chinese doing very well in business and so on. But they're not getting into politics in the numbers that you would expect. And there seems to be, a blockage there. So that's, part of the explosion of branch stacking. It's just frustration that they haven't got a voice. They haven't got much of a voice in the public services, and they haven't got much of a voice in the parliaments. A little bit more in local government, but so they're still outside. They're still political outsiders. And of the major parties, the Labor Party has done more in that regard, although still fairly marginal. But they have put Greeks into Parliament, they've put Italian in and so on. But it's not... and to that extent, they still have credibility. I mean, the party that does something for you is the party that got more credibility than the party that doesn't do anything for you. So to that extent, I think Labor Party has captured the ethnic vote, or at least enough of the ethnic vote to make a difference. I mean, McAllister's calculation, which is based on, much more mathematical than mine, mine's sort of street corner kind of intuition, is that the Southern European support for Labor made a difference of something like 2% a couple of elections ago. And now this is only ever 2 or 3% between the parties anyway. That's very important. So I still see that, you know, the ethnic vote is very varied and sort of coming in different shades, but on the whole it has for the last 15 years been more inclined to Labour than towards the Liberals. And because it's so large, it makes it that much more difficult for the Liberals to win. You know. I mean, I don't think it's the only fact, because the Liberals keep shooting themselves in the foot anyway, but it does make, it is definitely a bonus for the Labour Party.
You may have answered this question, but I'll just ask it anyway. In the current environment, you have argued that ethnic communities have not played a major role in political decision-making, as opposed to Birrell, who sees them having had effective control at times of the immigration agenda.
Yeah.
What is your view of the current debate about ethnic leadership in Australian politics?
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely disagree with Birrell, and I said that in the chapter in the politics book on the ethnic lobby. Well, I disagree with him on practically everything anyway, so that's not surprising. I do agree with him that the ethnic organisations, and particularly FECA, but also sort of the unorganised ethnic population, has had an impact on family reunion. And we would both agree on that, I think. It's partly, though, because, say, members of parliament in immigrant areas, a very large proportion of their business is immigration cases. That is, you come to your MP and say, I want to get my granny in, or I want to get my brother in, or something. So that is not, you know, an organised ethnic lobby. That is just the MP knowing from his local work that there is a big family reunion demand out there, and they are mostly Labour MPs because of the nature of the electorate, but Liberals get it too. National Party wouldn't get much, but both parties. So I would say yes, the ethnic influence on the family reunion program is strong, and that is why, despite people like Bob Birrell constantly wanting to cut it back, it doesn't actually get cut back as a proportion. I mean, all immigration has been cut back, but family reunion is still about half, and that's stayed the same. So, I mean, that's what annoys him, is that he can't get the family reunion cut, and it is true that the ethnic influence, and both organised or unorganised, is the major defender of that particular program. Although I think it doesn't have any influence on any of the other parts of the program at all, really. Very, very little. Now, the other part, half the question was what the ethnic involvement.
What is your view of the current debate about ethnic leadership?
Well, I'm not entirely sure what the current debate about ethnic leadership is. You mean between me and Birrell, or the ethnic lobby argument? Or?
The fact that, I guess, Birrell says that they have too much control.
Oh yes, too much influence. Well, I'll say this about Bob, that firstly, he's consistently over 20 years been an opponent of mass immigration, always. I mean, never changed his view, always had exactly the same view. He does not like immigration. Okay, first point. Second point is he's an Australian nationalist, which he himself would admit and doesn't pretend otherwise, and a particular kind of Australian nationalism which is based on the past of Australia, when it was a predominantly British Australian or Anglo-Australian country. And therefore he doesn't like either people coming in or people here already who question that basis and say, look, things have changed. So he has a fairly strong quite strong ideological positions, which make him very unsympathetic to multiculturalism, and also very sensitive to any kind of intrusion, as I think he would see it, of ethnics into the fair Australian garden, as Stalin once said. Let them keep their snouts out of our socialist garden, was one of Stalin's great statements. So this is let them keep their snouts out of our Australian garden. And there are a lot of people, often, quite relatively liberal people of Australian birth and origin, who resent what they see as foreigners or getting into the political process. And that's relevant again to ethnic branch stacking. I mean, branch stacking has gone on in the Labor Party certainly since the early 1920s. Been a major element in many states, of varying kinds, and the Labor Party's constantly, over the period now of 75 years, been changing its rules to limit branch stacking, control branch stacking. Pre-selection rackets and one sort or another. So it's not new at all. I mean, it's normal Labor Party practice in fact. But what the way it's been whooped up is ethnic branch stacking. Instead of bringing busloads of young Christian workers in, which was what Santa Maria used to do, or instead of writing out AWU tickets, and stacks of them, which is what they used to in Queensland, they're now bringing in busloads of Macedonians. Now, I think that's a pretty stupid thing to do, personally, but then I think branch stacking is pretty stupid. I don't think it's very clever, but nevertheless, it's really the feeling that because most ethnics are also immigrants, it's a feeling that they're really outsiders, that they're guests in the country, and that until they've really become real Australians, they really ought not to try and influence the political process. So there is quite a barrier against people. So that even people who are born in Australia have been, members of Parliament have been called wogs in Parliament, but they're born in Australia. I mean, what more can you ask? So there is that feeling that the political system belongs to the majority, and that the minority ought not have anything to do with it. Just as there used to be a feeling the political system belonged to men, and that women shouldn't be in it, and so on. And those are sort of subterranean feelings which are very widespread, I think, and which are activated. For example, if there's, if you get 60,000 Greeks turning out and demonstrating in Melbourne about Macedonia, the great majority of people react to that in a very hostile way, for two reasons. One is they're scared by, such large demonstrations are very unusual in Australia, and secondly because it's a foreign issue, nothing to do with us. So it's partly just, it's sort of xenophobia really. It's partly feeling that foreigners and outsiders shouldn't influence the political system because they don't have the interest of the country at heart. They've got the interest of some other country at heart. And it's partly that some of the manifestations of ethnic politics, like demonstrations, upset people. People like Australians don't actually like demonstrations. I mean, not only ethnic demonstrations, but any demonstration. They didn't like the Vietnam moratoriums. They really don't like any kind of politics which is at all excitable. And as some of the ethnic manifestations are fairly excitable. And that's also the constant looking for violence, which doesn't actually exist. I mean, if you get 60,000 people demonstrating, there's not a single arrest, that is not violence, but constantly, the slide from demonstrations of violence in the media is very, very quick, So there's, it's just that Australian politics isn't exciting, and it isn't an interest of the majority of people. And they don't like that. They don't like strikes, they don't like demonstrations, they don't like people chaining themselves to railings, they don't like flags and banners, they don't like any of these manifestations of excitability. And because politics in Australia has never, except for certain rare periods, never engaged the people very actively, it's seen as Nevertheless, I think there's a lot of resistance to foreigners, stroke outsiders, and Bob Birrell, shares that view. I mean, he accused me the other day. Well, we get on perfectly all right, personally, but he said, you're trying to rearrange the deck chairs, he said, because I was talking about, changing the ethnic composition of the institutions of government. So I said, well, the deck chairs are rearranged already. It's partly the idea that there is a real Australia, sort of mystical real Australia lurking in there somewhere, which has to be preserved, which is not a view that I share. I don't if there is a mystical Australia, I probably don't like it anyway. Whereas he does, you know, he's very, and a lot of people, although Melbourne Australian nationalist sort of tradition of Henry Lawson and all that stuff. You know. That's the real Australia. The real Australia is a sort of 1890s bushman. That's still quite strongly held amongst intellectuals in Melbourne. I don't know if it is in Sydney. I think they have a different notion there. Did that answer the question? That one right off?
No, that's fine. While we talk about academics, could you perhaps describe the dominant academic paradigms today with regard to the study of ethnic relations in Australia, and how have they changed over the past 20 years?
Well, the dominant academic paradigm is to totally ignore the subject and have nothing to do with it. Now, it really is a very minority interest, again compared to North America, but also compared even to Britain. There would, be more people and more resources academically tied up in Aboriginal studies, which is 1.5% of the population, than is tied up in ethnic studies, which is getting on for 20% of the population. Now, there's some reason for that. Obviously, Aboriginal studies would be strongest in Australia anyway, because that's where the Aborigines are, and you would expect that. And there's a long tradition in anthropology, Australian anthropology, going back to the 1920s, studying Aborigines. Nevertheless, for example, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies across the road here has an annual budget of $6 million, which it gets directly from the Commonwealth Government. Now, all our multicultural centres put together in Australia get from the Commonwealth Government by way of grant. No dollars at all. Not a cent. Everything we get from outside our own universities is competitive contract work, which is mainly from the Commonwealth Government, but also some state governments. Wollongong gets New South Wales state government. So we get nothing. The Aboriginal Institute gets $6 million, which I'm not against. I just wish we got it too. So that's a question of priority setting, that in terms of funding, ethnic and immigration studies have a very low priority, despite statements both by government, by DEET, by ARC and by other agencies that citizenship and cultural diversity are high priorities. They're not, in fact, high priorities when it comes to giving money. They're not high priorities in universities. Every centre in Australia, every immigration and multicultural centre in Australia is marginal. It's on their staff are on short-term contracts. They have to do outside work, and they're not, they have no permanent existence, and that even applies to Wollongong, which is the oldest and strongest. It applies in Sydney, it applies to me, it applies to all of us. We are clinging to the edge of our institutions. So what annoys me is people like Graham Campbell and Son coming along and talking about the millions that we're all making out of multiculturalism, because in fact we're not making anything out of it, except our salaries, which are slightly less than his. So there is not the input of money, either from the government or from the universities, into ethnic studies or immigration studies, that there is in other countries. For example, in Canada, when multiculturalism policy was adopted, they funded 16 chairs of ethnic studies in Canadian universities. Australia has never funded one chair of ethnic studies in an Australian university. In fact, the only person at professorial level in this area is Stephen Castles, the only person in the whole of Australia at professorial level. And he's technically a professor of sociology anyway. And that's, from his own university's money, it's not Commonwealth money. So there's no money there. We're all on the edge, and there are not very many of us. And the areas, there were originally several pioneers who were mostly here at the ANU, like Zabritsky, Price and Borry particularly. They're the sort of founding fathers of immigration studies and ethnic studies. And they're still around, although they've all retired. And Reg Appleyard over in Perth, who's also retired. So there is a sort of retired elder statesman group who are all still active. There's a second generation of people like Stephen Castles and myself, Christine English in Sydney and so on. But most of the growth in this area has not been in it's not been in immigration studies particularly. For example, here we have Barry York in our centre, who was appointed with a brief in ethnic and immigration history, and who claims that he's the only person in the whole of Australia, and probably is, has that as his brief. And who was also untenured, I might say, into the bargain. Now, where the growth has been is in professional and sub-academic areas, like training. There has been a growth of training. Training is, the thing. So there's cross-cultural training. And we were originally set up with a grant from a cross-cultural training program. Fortunately, we didn't have to do any of this, but nevertheless, that was where the original founding money of this centre came from, a deed grant connected with cross-cultural training. So there is a lot of money, both government and private contract money, in training. This is training public servants to operate the access and equity thing, for example. Now that is all very fine, but it's not what I would call, academic study. It's training. It's done by academics, but it's basically practical training on a short-term basis. And there's quite a lot of that around. And in fact, most of the centres, other than this one, rely to some extent on that. There is a Bureau of Immigration and Population Research, which is the largest single funder of immigration studies in Australia. Now that has a budget of less than 3 million as compared to the Aboriginal 6 million. That does its own research. It also funds others. Now, a couple of years ago, the last time we got a grant from them, there were 120 applicants and there were 8 grants. So there is a demand there, but it's not being met. So that although that again is attacked by people like Campbell and Birrell and others, as a propaganda machine for immigration, but that has been the greatest bonus that we've had in this area, is the setting up of the Bureau. Because if you look at the publications, the majority of serious academic publications are either funded by the Bureau or produced by the Bureau. The statistical stuff is produced by the Bureau. The bibliographies are produced by the Bureau. So the Bureau, which has been going for 6 years now, 5 years, that has been the biggest single indication of a government interest in immigration research. And it partly came because the Immigration Department itself was failing in that area. It had a pitiful research program, and in fact it abolished its research wing altogether, much to the annoyance of Bob Hawke at the time. So the Bureau, which is part of the Immigration Department technically, fills the gap because the department itself, its research activity had tapered away to nothing. And it is an area in which you have to have quite a lot of research because it's very complicated and involves law, sociology, politics, economics. It involves most of the social sciences. Now their focus has been very much on immigration, particularly economics of immigration, although they've broadened out. The study of ethnic communities is a different kettle of fish. They have studied some. They studied Vietnamese, studied the Jews, studied Africans, but that was mainly a sort of refugee settlement question. But basically, there is no government money in the study of ethnic communities, or very little. You're lucky to get yours. And yet there is a demand to do so. Communities want to be studied. There's plenty of amateur things being done and short-term things being done. So we lack in Australia what they have in America, have had for years in America, have in Canada, have in Britain, which is a academically respectable body of ethnic studies. We just lack that. And I mean, the biggest thing is the encyclopedia, of course, which was a product of the bicentennial, from which $1 million was put into that. So I can't, complain that nothing was done. But that really is the source for studying the vast majority of the lesser. I mean, is the only source for studying a lot of them. Now that's out of print, and we're hoping to get a second edition. But it still is the single source. So when you get into debates like, whether people are loyal to Australia or whether this and this, it's all done off the top of people's heads, because they don't have any real basis for saying. They don't know, for example, what is going on. There's no academic study of ethnic communities, of their structures. There's no academic study of FECA or of the ECCs or of the Greek community, Italian community, and so on. And most of such studies as there have been sort of histories, often with the very 19th century. You can find out much more about 19th century Chinese in Australia than you can about 20th century Chinese. A part of that is just, priority setting. Part of it is, of course, the ethnic communities haven't been a problem. Aborigines are a problem, so they get studied. Equally in Britain, the Indian and Western Indian populations are seen as a problem because of the strength of racism there. So they're studied because they're a problem. Same with black studies in America. But because ethnic communities here aren't a problem, they don't, they've been so well behaved, they haven't attracted much academic attention. So I would say, there's a lot more resources in training, language, not at the, the literary level of language, but at the sort of interpreting, translating level of language, which is fairly poverty-stricken level. Training of public servants, even so now some training in private sector, that has expanded quite rapidly. I mean, the sort of utilitarian level, but at the more abstract academic level, if the bureau was abolished, the whole thing would be back to where it was 20 years ago, I think.
20 years ago, Jersey was, struggling is not the right word, but
aspiring to develop.
It's, I suppose, to develop some kind of theory of multiculturalism or Australian model for it, and settle perhaps on the term of cultural pluralism, which, as far as I can tell, in the Settler and Departure, and then his 1977 publication, Jean Martin, those words have never actually been said. So that was one kind of academic attempt to describe the situation then, or perhaps provide a model for it. Do you think any more work along those lines has been done, or is it still, is that it really?
No, there's not a great deal of, I don't do much. I'm being forced into it now because of this sort of citizenship debates going up to 2001. One reason, another reason is that I'm fairly tied into doing government contract work, which is settlement-related stuff. And the third reason is I spend a lot of my time rebutting critics of multiculturalism, which is a sort of intellectually fairly low-level activity, but quite enjoyable and useful. So I must admit that I haven't done a great deal in that area, and maybe I should have done, but I haven't.
Have there been any key reports that have developed that cultural pluralism model?
Not really, No, the whole thing, well, firstly, is because a lot of it emerges from government. It is not on a very high intellectual level. Government reports are put together by stitching together the claims of various interests, both within the government and outside. The intellectual level of FECA has always been quite low, I think. They follow in an ancient Australian tradition of being very unintellectual and very pragmatic and sort of practically oriented. I don't think the ethnic communities movement, the exception of Walter Lippmann, who was there already, be hard to think of Peter Shergold, who was their honorary research advisor, but didn't hold a position within the power structure. They haven't produced any intellectuals at all. Absolutely none. And in fact, people like George Zabriskie wouldn't go near them. They're totally separate from. I mean, George and Jean Martin, who died, they worked together quite closely in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, trying to work out a theory. The only other person who has done this is George Smolletch in Adelaide. And I always say it's not coincidental that Smolletch and Zabriskie are both Poles. They sort of come in a rather different intellectual, sort of Central European intellectual tradition, which likes to theorise a lot more than us Anglo-Saxons. Most of the intellectual work comes from North America, and it's just second-hand and warmed over, which is, true in most of the social sciences, but it's a bit problematic here because our situation is not the same as the United States at all. I mean, it's different in a whole lot of ways. So a lot of the stuff is just second-hand imported from America, to a lesser extent Canada. And of course George was in Canada with Tony Richmond, and he was influenced from there. But I would think George Zabriskie, Jean Martin, who's now dead, and George Smolletch are practically the only academics who tried to work out a general theory. All the rest of it's just pragmatic of how to community relations strategies, and a lot of it comes out of the Commonwealth Public Service, where there are a lot of the public servants are not experts in this field, or indeed in any field. If they are, they're experts in economics. Sociology, I think, is very weak in Australia. And that's been a major input in Europe and North America, but I don't have much of a regard for Australian sociology. In any case, they've had very little interest in this area. We won't say anything about political science because there's only about me and Ian McAllister most political, so we've had very little input. You have had a bit of sort of negative discussion amongst conservative intellectuals about multiculturalism, people like Cooker, Thasset, Duntroon, Lachlan Chipman, I don't know, I wouldn't call Sestito an intellectual, but anyway, the group of people, particularly at La Trobe, Wollongong, and I think Adfa, Duntroon. There has been a sort of attempt to develop a conservative counter-argument. I don't think that's had much influence. The dominant influence is government, and government is not interested in theories of society very much. I mean, it's interested in nuts and bolts and pragmatic adjustments and so on. And there's no real counterweight. There's not enough strength in the universities, not enough people interested in the universities to provide a counterweight to that. See, I really don't think anyone, quite frankly, anyone paid any attention to George Zabriskie. I think, he was a favourite son of the Immigration Department for many years. He was on the AIMA Council. He was chairman of the Ethnic Affairs. But now he doesn't get anything from the Labor governments at all. Somebody say like Andrew Jakubowicz and Stephen Castles worked out a sort of quasi-Marxist critique of multiculturalism, which had a little bit of an impact on the left, of a lot of people like Stuart West. But no one would call Stuart West an intellectual, not even his mother, So they were having a bit of, I think people like Jakubowicz, Castles, Jill Bottomley, there was a sort of left, Jock Collins, there was a sort of left critical group in Sydney. But we don't need critics, I mean, we need friends. We've got enough enemies as it is without being outflanked from the left as well. So I think they were trying to work out, a different approach which would be based more on class and inequality and so on, and that's had some influence. It's had influence, I think, mainly in Sydney. It's had influence on some of the ethnic women's speak out group from Lidcombe, and you pick that up more when you go to Sydney, that they are sort of Collins and Jakubowicz and Castles oriented. I don't think it had any impact in Melbourne. They've been rather two different traditions. I don't think it's had any impact in Canberra either. I don't think it's had any significant impact on the Commonwealth public service.
Will we then go on to don't settle for less? Or
you could, yes.
Yeah,
Plenty of time. No, you can go a bit after 12 if you like. Someone's coming at 12:30. But
well, we've actually got an interview.
You've got to go,
so
okay.
We too have to go. What were the main reasons for the Jupp review? What were the main effective outcomes of the review? I've got a few more questions after that, along the lines of what were the main recommendations which should have been but were not taken up by the government? How was it received by government ministers? Its relationship with the 86 budget, etc., etc.
Well, to some extent that's covered in Barry's interview. To some extent I can't remember what the recommendations were anyway without having them in front of me. It was set up, and this is what they assured me at the time, purely for administrative routine purposes, that although you can never actually believe what public servants tell you, because they don't necessarily know the truth themselves, let alone convey it to anybody else. But they kept telling me there wasn't a secret agenda, which suggests strongly that there was. And their thought processes are so Byzantine, particularly in immigration, that you really don't know what they're doing. But the Galbally had been reviewed by AMA in 1982 or 3, whatever, don't know. And they had done this very thorough $1 million analysis of Galbally. And one of their recommendations was that a further evaluation should be made in 3 years' time. So it had come up, through the process, and they said, right, the 3 years are up, we'll have a further review. And that was their argument as to why it was set up. It was not set up in response to demands from the ethnic communities. It was set up, or from anybody, it was set up as a routine commitment within the immigration department. And in fact it was regarded with, I think, with some suspicion by FECA.
Why was that?
Oh, because of the atmosphere at the time, which in fact led to the 1986 budget, which was that government they felt, and they were right, that not only FECA but the ECCs and a lot of the ethnic specific services felt that the review would lead to a cutting back, because government was remember it ran into a bit of a crisis about 86, and cutting back was in the air. There were also various idiot people in the immigration department who'd gone around telling ethnic specific groups, that their time was up and their days were numbered, and that. So they'd created a lot of hostile expectations. We found when we started that there was a lot of resistance to the thing, because they felt we'd been set up to cut back, particularly on ethnic specific services. Now they didn't get that from us, because in fact, if the object of the immigration department was to cut back on ethnic specific services, then they appointed all the wrong people to the committee, you see, because all 4 of us were in favour. Now that, nevertheless, there were certainly people in the immigration department who thought the Galbally approach had reached the end of its useful life. And you can see that in what's happened since, that they really wanted to move away from the ethnic-specific grant system for some good reasons, towards a more planned, system where they weren't just responding to requests from ethnic groups. Also, many of the newer ethnic groups were very ramshackle little outfits. They were giving money to. They were actually forming, say, Filipino groups so that they could apply for a grant because there was a problem. So it was all getting a bit artificial. I mean, very few of the ethnic communities had the structure of Greek welfare, Jewish welfare, on which it was based. So it was getting a bit artificial, having to actually invent groups in order to give them money. They were a bit amateurish. The social welfare profession, I think, regards a lot of ethnic-specific welfare workers as, hopeless amateurs. And this was a big row between Walter Lippmann and ACOS. I witnessed part of that actually going on between Walter and Merle Mitchell. So the social work profession was a bit sort of haughty about ethnic-specific welfare workers. But the really big thing that emerged during our... so the Galbally thing was under threat. They were right. They had actually got it right, and they had picked this up from listening to what was going around the traps. But the other thing which became obviously much more noticeable after our report, which wasn't entirely clear to us at the time, was that the Immigration Department really wanted to mainstream services. They wanted to, in effect, as far as possible, actually pull out of welfare altogether, but they couldn't do that because no one else would take it on. They kept trying to push migrant welfare off onto that department, which keeps changing its name, but which is basically community services, and they wouldn't take it because they didn't believe in ethnic-specific services, they believed in mainstream services. So it was really immigration trying to unload some of its commitments onto others. And particularly onto DSS and DHH and whatever it was called. And that was the hidden agenda, really. I mean, insofar as there was a hidden agenda, that was it. We were not briefed at all. I wouldn't say we weren't properly briefed. We weren't briefed at all. The Minister, Chris Herford, took very little interest in it. I think I talked to him a couple of times. And when the report was over, he didn't speak to me at all for several months until he met me by accident, actually at Wollongong. So one had to assume that he didn't like the report, and that we hadn't said what he'd wanted us to say. But as he'd never told us what he wanted us to say, how could we know? Anyway, he disappeared eventually. But so we were certainly not being led by the Minister. The Minister had, a very marginal interest in the whole thing. Immigration, the office was in Canberra. Immigration Department was, through David Page, was briefing Sue Ingram, who was our secretary, every day. They really were down there every day. So they wanted something out of it, but it was never made clear to me or to any others, what they wanted. But basically, I think what they wanted was to move away from the Galbally model, to mainstream services out to other departments, with a long-term strategy, I think, of pulling out of migrant welfare altogether, except for new arrivals. They admitted that they had a responsibility, but they wanted to do what Fitzgerald later recommended 2 years later, which was to limit their responsibility to the first 2 or 3 years. Fitzgerald actually, they managed to get through Fitzgerald several things they couldn't get through us, because that's how they work. They just put it back in the filing cabinet and take it out next time. The one thing they couldn't get through us was this limitation of services to the first 3 years. Now, as they had on the committee, Nina Skoroszewska, who was leading in the Polish welfare, and as most of the Poles have been here for 20 or 30 years, pretty unrealistic to expect her to accept that. Then they had Steve Karras, who's Greek from the ECC of Queensland, as the Greeks have mostly been here for 20 or 30 years. Very unrealistic to expect him. Then I was an unknown quantity because they hadn't, dealt with me really before. And sorry, I forgot the name of the other person, but she was in Melbourne welfare, of Italian origin, but not very. There were 3 ethnics and me. So if they had wanted to get this sort of thing through, they should have chosen a different committee. So it's a sort of contradictory process. Anyway, of course, we got from our submissions, we got very strong support for continuation of ethnic-specific welfare for everybody, because they all put in submissions saying what a wonderful job they were doing and how they needed more money, which is, again, what you would expect and what these things... and, of course, the older communities were very, very anxious about this proposal to only support the newer communities, naturally enough. And we just took the line that, settlement was a lifelong process. Could be a lifelong process, which was direct opposite of, I think, of what the Immigration Department wanted us to say, which is that settlement is a... They kept wanting us to define settlement, which we refused to do, because we say it's different for different people. I think that's probably why the report was buried, because we didn't really say what Fitzgerald later said was Immigration Department was only responsible for the first 3 years. Everything else should go off to the welfare departments. There was also a lot of bureaucratic stuff about Commonwealth-state relations. And we were constantly being briefed as we went along, day by day, by Immigration Department officers. So, they obviously saw us as an agency through which they could put... One of the things they wanted to put through was that state agencies should pay for telephone interpreting. Because Queensland in particular had been using telephone interpreting for its hospitals and not paying a cent to the Commonwealth. So we were persuaded, I think wrongly as it turned out, that agency user pays for TIS was a good idea. Actually, it's turned out to be a bad idea. But the Immigration Department definitely wanted that. They definitely wanted the states, particularly, to pay for TIS because they were providing. And Queensland was the main offender. Queensland had no interpreting service of its own. It simply used the Commonwealth ones for nothing. So we were persuaded of that, and I think we shouldn't have been. So that was one mistake we made. What we did do, and which did have a positive... I think that was a negative outcome because it's meant that TIS services are being cut back now because the police and so on, agencies won't put it in their budget because they've been cut back. Positive outcome was the setting up of what became OMA, that we echoed Galbally and said it's no good having access and equity and equitable services and all this on paper if you don't have a monitoring agency within government which will actually see that it's done. Because the experience from Galbally to us, which was 8 years, was that these programs were not being properly implemented and they were not reaching down to the counter level particularly, or the middle management level. They were putting in reports saying we've done this and this, but nothing was actually happening. So I think that was a positive outcome. I think we were a major influence on access and equity as it developed, and we also were responsible for setting up the Office of Multicultural Affairs, although we'd called it Ethnic Affairs. But where we were, I think, wrong, and where Bob Hawke was right, was that putting it in Prime Ministers. We had a very, very long argument as to where the office should be. We talked to Peter Walensky, who was then Secretary, I think, of PM&C. Immigration Department was extremely anxious to keep it in immigration. So they kept feeding all the arguments as to why it should be kept in immigration. So we said, okay. Eventually, we said, okay, keep it in immigration.
What were their reasons?
Oh, well, there was some good reason that they had the expertise and the knowledge already, which is true. I mean, they were the only department which had anything to do with ethics, if they possibly. So we accepted that in the end. But I mean, we went into it great. But the decision that it should go into Prime Ministers was made by Bob Hawke, personally, and that was in response to the budget demonstration. And that was a correct decision, I think, because PM&C is a more powerful department than immigration.
Who do you think influenced Bob Hawke to move where you recommended to go into the immigration to PM&C?
I don't know. I think he always had a very, as many other people do, a very sceptical attitude to the immigration department. The immigration department doesn't have a very good reputation around Canberra, and for various reasons, most of them good. Because of the demonstrations and protests about the 86 budget and about the SBS amalgamation, which I think was at the same time, I think he just made a personal political decision that it had to be in PM&C. Now, PM&C, the point that really affected us was that PM&C didn't want it. Their public servants told us that they told us very specifically that they didn't want it. Because they were afraid that they would have to administer the grant and aid system, which they didn't want. Because the grant and aid system is a pain in the neck to administer, because you're constantly subject to political pressures. It's a very small sum of money for a very great deal of work, and you can't win. Because if you give money to the Greeks, the Turks will want it. If you give money to the Turks, the Arabs will want it. And, you can't win. Granted aid is just it's a very small sum of money. You're talking about $10 million, which is nothing in government terms. But it's not, it's a can of worms. So they didn't want it. And in fact, they didn't get it. Because and we weren't recommending that they should do it anyway. When OMA was created within PM&C, specifically it's left the grant and aid with immigration. So immigration still got it. And so that was that was one of the factors that decided me, was that PM&C didn't really want it. They made it quite clear in writing, in fact, I think, that they didn't want it. So it was not the department, it was the Prime Minister himself that made that decision. And it's still there, and it's remained there. Now, when you look back on it, that's where it should have gone. And that's where we wanted to put it in the first place. And we were talked out of it by Immigration Department. Now, the whole thing was totally buggered up, as you'll see from reading the literature, by the 1986 budget. That budget was introduced with no consultation with us whatsoever, with no regard to any of the work we had done, and went directly opposite to everything we'd said. Because one of the key recommendations, which is also in Galbally and has been in every report that there's ever been, is the importance of English to employment and citizenship and everything. And of course what they did in that budget was cut back on the English. So that was a direct opposite of us, and it left us completely up a gum tree, and we got blamed for it. And when I went to the FECA conference in Adelaide, that was the one at which Chris Herford was booed and walked out, despite the fact that he only lived a mile away. He never came back. And now he should have been booed, but I shouldn't have been booed, because it wasn't my fault. But FECA isn't necessarily always terribly well informed about the real world, and they blame me for it. Now they don't anymore, but they certainly did, several months afterwards, because of this previous belief that they'd always had, that the whole object of our report, of our committee, was to cut back. So when things were cut back, they then came to the conclusion it was our fault, but in fact that's not the case. Because, as far as we were concerned, the budget was a total disaster and completely chopped our report to pieces. And in fact, the report was never mentioned again. ever afterwards by government. It was years before it would appear in government bibliographies and things. I mean, they just tried to pretend that it never happened. And the minister tried to pretend that as well.
Was it tabled?
Yes. Yes, it was tabled, but it was never debated, and there was no press release, there was no launch, there was, as far as I'm concerned, so this was my first experience of government, so it was interesting. But I've learned a lot since then. But that budget was, as far as our report goes, a total disaster, because, it just was the exact opposite. The other thing which we were blamed for was the abolition of AIMA, which we did not recommend at all. And if you look at the report, it says that there should be a monitoring office, which became OMA, but that the research function of AIMA should continue. Now, and Bob Hawke was involved in this, what I found out later was that the Immigration Department had been trying to abolish AIMA for several years. They actually had an unofficial working party, and they were the object of abolishing AIMA. And when OMA was set up, they immediately seized on that to abolish AIMA. Now, I had George Zabritsky coming into my office full of anxiety, and did you recommend that? I said, no, we didn't recommend that at all. So, it's the way that departments sort of hang these things on. And in fact, what we said, and Bob Hawke made fun of us in Parliament about this, we said there should be a monitoring agency and there should be a research agency. And he'd been briefed presumably by Hereford or something. And he sort of said, well, they want both of these, ridiculous. But that's exactly what they ended up with, because they ended up with the Bureau and they ended up with AIMA. So we were right, but we were never given any credit for that. And, we were blamed for the abolition of AIMA, we were blamed for the budget cuts. The report was buried. However, it survived, and it is regularly referred to now. And eventually, it came to be, once the ethnic communities got around to reading it and thinking about it, they now. When it really was a defence of the ethnic specific thing and a defence of all sorts of things. And many of the recommendations have gradually seeped their way through, mainly through the access and equity strategy. They're mostly access and equity type recommendations.
What link was there between the term access and equity?
Oh, well, that was another strange thing. What they were doing, at the same time that they were running our committee, the Immigration Department was also running the National Population Council, which did two inquiries. One is into settlement policy, which is what we were doing, and one is into access and equity, which is what we were doing. So they were running at the same time, they were running our committee, but they were also running the National Population Council in the same area. And I think that was to widen their options, because they didn't know what our committee would recommend. In fact, obviously, as I've suggested, it recommended a lot of things they didn't want and didn't recommend a lot of things they did want.
Did you question the duplication at the time?
Yes, I got on to David Cox, who was chairman.
And?
Oh, yeah, well, we sort of agreed that we wouldn't tread on each other's feet too much. And, that we'd exchange information. But that was just done by me going to him. It wasn't done. Because it was just ridiculous. I mean, they set us up, and then when I came to look at the NPC, they were doing exactly the same thing. And I now think that was just to keep their options open so they could play between the two. Anyway, I got a very jaundiced view of the Immigration Department as a result, and particularly of Chris Hereford, who was really a pompous idiot, I think, and who's left politics since. I think he and the then Secretary of the Department, who's now dead, were really assimilationists, basically. They didn't like the Galbally thing. They didn't, they were really...
How did you get that? How did you form that view?
Oh, just from listening to them talking. I mean, we had a couple of sessions where we sat around. They were both pretty negative about the ethnic specific services. I mean, Walter was the main defender of ethnic specific right the way through. I mean, we came out for the MRCs. Well, again, Immigration Department would basically love the MRCs to be abolished. In fact, it's already abolished one of them. Because they really don't... Firstly, a lot of these things are very amateurish. I mean, they're not as amateurish as Aboriginal things where millions and millions of dollars just disappear. But nevertheless, they are amateurish. And I suppose that offends the public servants. But also, it's difficult to control them. And they really like to control everything, I think.
I think a case in point, there's probably the Illawarra Migrant Resource Centre, which has played an important role in the community.
Oh, I mean, I think MRCs were a very good idea, and I think all the reports that I've made, including the refugee one, which has just come out, is that MRCs should be a focal point for services and they should be built up. But basically, I think Immigration Department doesn't like them. Now, what they did is that they put some of their ideas through Fitzgerald. The funny thing was, though, that both Fitzgerald and Ramampus recommended that the adult migrant English program be transferred to DEET, which also, in the view of the subsequent history of DEET, would probably have been a very bad idea. But the Immigration Department wanted to hang on to that because that's their largest single budget item, and they still got it. So they beat me and they beat Fitzgerald. Well, we were trying to build a sort of strategy around English teaching so that English teaching would be integrated into the TAFE system, because it varies from state to state. I mean, it is in the TAFE system in New South Wales, but it's separate in Victoria, and so it varies from state. So we really wanted to mainstream English teaching and bring in the vast resources of the education system. And we thought that would best be done by transferring it to DEET. But anyway, they resisted that, and then Fitzgerald recommended the same. It's the only recommendation I think we both made, and they resisted that, and they've still got it. And I think the problem there is if you take the AMEP budget away from immigration, you've not got much left. You know, the question then arises of why not abolish the Immigration Department altogether, because it's still one of the smaller departments. So I think they saw that. A lot of it was interdepartmental negotiation of that sort. DEET actually wanted the AMEP. They weren't fanatical, but they were perfectly happy to take it. Whereas the Community Services Department definitely did not want ethnic-specific services. You know. So you had quite a lot of our consultations were with Commonwealth Government departments. So, all the ethnic input was really asking for more, basically. I mean, that was their main. On protecting what they had and asking for more. We didn't get any innovative ideas out of the ethnic consultations. I don't think anyone ever gets very many innovative ideas out of ethnic consultations, really. Maybe they do. They keep having them, but I mean, nothing new ever comes up that I've ever heard.
I guess just one last question. When you were on the Council for Multicultural Affairs, there was some talk there of establishing a Multiculturalism Act.
Yes.
Can you talk, which seems to have died a quiet death, could you talk a bit about?
Yes, that was, I think, seen as the major function of ACMA, and when it didn't happen, I mean, that was one reason why ACMA was not revised, I think, because they couldn't think what it was for. Whereas, I mean, it should have been a General Advisory Committee to OMA, which is really what it would have been a useful function, but public service tends to think of these things as being set up to carry out a particular function and then abolish and then do something. So there's not much continuity in any of these advisory bodies. Yes, the Multiculturalism Act was on our agenda. I must say that I wasn't in favour of it. Fecca was. The model was the Canadian one, and we actually got that distributed around. The main problem, I mean, I was against it I think that's a fair summary. I was against it. For two reasons. One is political, that the opposition was opposed to it. And my feeling was that you couldn't, if in Canada, you see, it was passed unanimously through the Parliament. My feeling was that it would be counterproductive to force it through the Parliament against the opposition. And I think, I still think that was sound. Well, they changed their views since then, but at the time, I think Howard was the leader, they were very strongly opposed to it. And the second was that even more than the Canadian one, it was a very motherhood. The proposing was very motherhood, it was a statement of. And what we said, and Hanifa, Dean Oswald and I got a whiteboard out, and put it all up for them, was that if you were going to have a multiculturalism act, there's not much point having an act saying Australia is a multicultural society and we should all love each other, because that's, okay, but pointless. That it really had to create some institutions, like it had to institutionalise OMA, which is currently only in office and could be abolished tomorrow just by the Secretary of the Department signing a memo, It really had to institutionalise OMA and institutionalise access and equity and probably institutionalise, some research institute, because I'm not sure whether the Bureau had started then, I don't think it had. So we really said, there's no point in having an act unless it sets a few things in concrete for the future. Well, they didn't really want that. I say also that our chairman, Mr. Justice Sir James Gobbo, was very weak on multiculturalism at the time because it was under attack and he was just backing right off. And the main reason is really that he's a Liberal. The Liberal Party was attacking multiculturalism and he was backing right off. But anyway, I was opposed to it and those were my reasons. And if you don't like them, that's too bad. And Thacker was in favour of it, but again, they hadn't really thought it out. They hadn't really thought, what's the point of it? They really were at the stage of wanting an act which said Australia is a multicultural society. And we were a bit ahead of that. I must say that ACMA was a very good council, actually. I think it was one of the best, in terms of the qualification of people on it, one of the best advisory councils that there's been. Anyway, I think the government called off it. And if we'd very strongly pushed it, no doubt they would have done something. But I think they did call off it for that political reason that the opposition was against it. And they didn't want the kind of public brawl that there would have been if they tried to push it through. Otherwise, we did, I think Robert Ray was the minister at the time. Prime Minister showed an active interest in that when he chaired a couple of meetings. And that. The other thing that we were engaged in, which did come to fruition, was the agenda. And that did come to fruition. And I think once we knocked back the act, we didn't, officially vote on it or anything, but we showed a distinct lack of enthusiasm. And once we got the agenda, a lot of the work we did was actually going through the agenda. And then once that was launched, I don't think there's so much point in renewing the council, which was a pity, because they should have done. I think OMA would have been a much more effective body now if ACMA had continued.
Who actually influenced the shape of the agenda?
Secretariat, which comes from OMA. Well, that committee came from OMA. The other ones have come from Immigration Department. This was the first advisory committee which was not answerable to immigration, it was answerable to Prime Minister. So that was, shifting. It was the definitive shifting of responsibility of multiculturalism away from immigration and towards, the mainstream or towards the main power centre. And Hawke came along to a couple each year, because it was a bit of a hot issue at the time. Ruxton was going off his brain about it. Howard was attacking it. Multiculturalism was quite controversial. And of course we were there to defend it, which we did. But the agenda was, most of the work we were doing was going through the agenda. But all these committees, the Secretariat draws up the agenda and puts the documents in. Very little comes in from anywhere else. I mean, theoretically, any member could put an item on the agenda, but hardly anybody ever does. So they can steer it to some extent. I mean, they weren't a collection of deadheads by any means, but I mean, they could say, well, look, we'd like you to do this. So the work programme would be set by OMA, and OMA officers, including the acting director, they always sat in right the way through. They staffed it, there'd be half a dozen OMA people there. And they, got you plane tickets and did all that stuff from that right the way up to drafting the stuff for you. And equally with Romampus, that was staff from the Immigration Department. And, we had a staff of about 10 working on that. And Fitzgerald, they'd be staff from Immigration. But that's quite normal. So I think that was the main thing that came